The first photograph appeared on a Tuesday. Not on her phone, not in her inbox, not anywhere she would have expected. It was tucked into the front pocket of her backpack, the one she never opened during lectures, the one she kept zipped tight and pressed against her hip as she walked through the corridors of Ashwood University. When she finally unzipped it that evening, sitting cross-legged on the narrow bed of her dormitory room, her fingers brushed against the glossy surface of the print before her mind even registered what it was. She pulled it out slowly. It was a photograph of her. Not a selfie, not something she had taken herself or posed for. It was taken from a distance, from somewhere elevated, somewhere far away, and it showed her walking across the courtyard outside the library, her hair catching the wind, her face turned slightly to the left as though she had heard something and glanced toward it. She was wearing the gray coat she had put on that very morning, the coat she had only bought 3 days before. She stared at the photograph for a long time. Her name was Elena. She was 22 years old, a postgraduate student studying comparative literature at Ashwood, one of those old and gray and moss-eaten universities in the north of England that seemed to have been built specifically to make people feel small. The buildings were tall and cold, and the corridors smelled of damp stone. The library was a cathedral of silence. The campus sat on a hill surrounded by fog for most of the year, and the streetlights never seemed bright enough to push the darkness back entirely. Elena had been there for 4 months. She had made a handful of friends, not close friends, not the kind you called when something frightened you, and she had a boyfriend. His name was Marcus. They had been together for 7 months, and he was gentle and warm and always seemed to know exactly what to say when she felt lost. He visited her on weekends. He brought her coffee and sat with her in the library while she worked on her thesis. He kissed her forehead when he left and told her he would be back soon. She showed Marcus the photograph the next time he visited. He looked at it carefully, turning it over in his hands. There was nothing on the back, no writing, no watermark, no indication of where it had come from or who had taken it. "It's probably just someone messing around," he said and handed it back to her. "Someone on campus, you know how people are." She nodded. She put the photograph in a drawer and tried not to think about it. The second photograph appeared 3 days later. This one was in her coat pocket, the gray coat. She found it when she reached for her keys while walking home from a late seminar. This photograph was different from the first. It showed her sitting in the university cafe, a book open in front of her, a cup of tea wrapped in both hands. Her face was relaxed. Her eyes were unfocused, the way they got when she was deep in thought. She looked peaceful. She did not feel peaceful now. She turned the photograph over, nothing on the back. She looked around the corridor where she was standing. It was empty. The fluorescent light above her buzzed and flickered. Somewhere far away, a door closed. She walked faster. By the end of that week, there were 5 photographs. Each one showed her in a different location, the dormitory hallway, the edge of the campus gardens, sitting alone on a bench near the old chapel. Each one was taken from a different angle. Some were close, some were far away. Some seemed to have been taken through glass, through a window she hadn't noticed, or a reflection she hadn't seen. She began to feel something she had not felt since childhood, a sensation she could not name at first but which settled into her body like cold water. It was the feeling of being watched, not casually, not the way strangers glance at each other in crowded rooms. This was sustained, deliberate, patient. Someone was following her, and they had been doing it for a long time. She told Marcus everything. She spread the photographs across her desk and showed him each one, pointed out the angles, the impossible distances, the way some of them seemed to capture moments she could barely remember living through. Marcus listened. He nodded. He held her hand. "Have you shown these to anyone else?" he asked. "No," she said. "I don't know who to show them to." "Don't," he said quietly. "Not yet. Let me look into it first. I know some people on campus. I can ask around." She felt grateful. She felt safe, in the way you feel safe when someone tells you they are going to fix something broken. She did not know then what Marcus was. The teaching assistant's name was Daniel. She had seen him around campus for weeks before she ever spoke to him. A tall figure in dark clothing, always at the edges of rooms, always half turned away as though he were in the middle of leaving. He had pale skin and dark hair that fell across his forehead, and his eyes were a shade of gray so light they almost looked white. He taught a seminar on Gothic literature that Alina attended once a week. He spoke softly. He never raised his voice. When he talked about the authors on the syllabus, about obsession, about surveillance, about the boundaries between self and other, he spoke as though he were describing something he had witnessed firsthand. The first time Alina spoke to him directly was at the end of October. She had stayed late after the seminar to ask a question about her thesis. The classroom had emptied. The overhead lights had been turned off, and the only light came from the tall arched windows, gray and dim with the last of the afternoon. Daniel was standing at the front of the room, gathering papers into a leather folder. He looked up when she approached, and something flickered across his face, something fast and unreadable. "Alina," he said, not a question, as though he already knew her name. "I wanted to ask about the secondary sources for my chapter on Shelley," she said. He smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it made her skin prickle in a way she couldn't explain. "Walk with me," he said. "I'll tell you everything you need to know." They walked across the campus together as the light faded. Daniel knew the university the way someone knows a house they have lived in for decades, every shortcut, every hidden courtyard, every door that was supposed to be locked but wasn't. He pointed out details Alina had never noticed. A carving above a doorway, a window that looked out onto nothing but fog, a staircase that led to a room no one seemed to use. He was charming. He was intelligent. He made her laugh once near the end of their walk, and she felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of tension she hadn't been aware she was carrying. When she got back to her room that night, she found the sixth photograph. This one was on her pillow. It showed her walking with Daniel. It showed the two of them from behind, side by side, their shadows stretching long across the stone path. It was taken from above, from one of the upper windows of the main building, perhaps. The angle was precise. The framing was deliberate. Someone had been watching them. Over the next 2 weeks, Alina began to notice other things. Small things. Things that could have been coincidence if coincidence were not so persistent. Daniel was always where she was. Not obviously. Not in a way that would seem suspicious to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But he was there, in the cafe when she went for coffee, in the library when she studied, once on the bench outside the chapel where she liked to sit alone and think. Each time he would notice her and wave or nod or simply smile, that small, careful smile. Each time it felt natural. It felt like a happy accident. It was not. The photographs continued. By mid-November, there were 14. Alina kept them all in a box under her bed. She did not show them to anyone except Marcus, and Marcus continued to reassure her. He told her he was looking into it. He told her not to worry. He told her it was probably just a prank. But Alina had begun to pay closer attention. She had begun to look at the photographs, really look at them, and what she found made her hands shake. Some of the photographs were dated. Not on the prints themselves, but on the metadata Alina found when she photographed each one with her phone and ran them through an image analysis tool she downloaded from the university's research software library. The creation dates on the original files, dates that should have been embedded when the photographs were first taken, did not match the timeline Alina knew. 3 of the photographs were dated before Alina had ever arrived at Ashwood University. She sat on her bed and stared at her laptop screen and tried to understand what that meant. The photographs showed her, undeniably her, in her clothes. In locations she recognized, but the dates said they had been taken weeks before she had set foot on campus, weeks before anyone at Ashwood could have known she existed. It was impossible, unless someone had known about her long before she knew about them. The realization came to Alina on a cold night in late November, in the space between one breath and the next, like a door opening onto a room she had always known was there, but had never been willing to open. She went through Marcus's phone. He had left it on the desk while he showered. She had not planned to look through it. She told herself later that something had made her do it, some instinct, some pull she could not have named. She picked it up and opened it and scrolled through his messages, and within 30 seconds she found what she was looking for. A conversation with Daniel, dozens of messages stretching back months, back to before Alina and Marcus had even met. The messages were brief and precise. Coordinates, schedules, descriptions of what Alina was wearing on specific days, times she would be alone, routes she walked, places she sat, all of it cataloged. All of it sent from Marcus to Daniel, message after message, like reports filed by an informant. And interspersed among them, Daniel's replies, short, grateful, hungry. Perfect, keep going. Does she suspect anything? You're doing beautifully. Alina read every message. She read them once, then twice, then a third time as though repetition might change what they said. It did not. Marcus had been paid, not in money, in access. Daniel had given him something, offered him something, though the nature of the arrangement was never stated plainly in the messages. What was clear was that Marcus had known from the beginning. From the very first day he had approached Alina in the campus bookshop and smiled at her and asked her name. He had known exactly who she was and exactly why he was there. She closed the phone and set it down on the desk and sat very still. When Marcus came out of the shower, towel around his waist, steam rising from his skin, he looked at her face and his expression changed. The warmth drained out of it. Something else moved in behind his eyes, something flat and cold and careful. Alina, he said. She did not answer. He did not try to explain. That night, after Marcus left quickly, without looking at her, without another word, Alina sat alone in her dormitory room and looked at the wall above her desk. She had not looked closely at that wall in weeks. She had been so focused on the photographs in her box, on the ones she had found in her pockets and her bags and on her pillow, that she had not thought to look at what was already in front of her. The wall was covered. Not with her photographs, with Daniel's, dozens of them printed on plain paper, pinned in rows and columns with small red thumbtacks. Each one showed Alina. Each one was taken from a different angle at a different time in a different light. Some were sharp and clear. Others were blurred as though taken through fog or glass or water. Some showed her sleeping. And in the corner of the frame, in photograph after photograph, barely visible, almost invisible, a shadow. A figure, standing just at the edge of the light, watching. Alina looked at the photographs. She looked at the shadow. She looked at the corner of her room where the darkness pooled deepest, and she did not move, and she did not breathe, and she waited. Before you keep reading, stop. Close your eyes for 3 seconds. Open them again. Look around the room you are in right now. Look at the corners. Look at the spaces behind you. If everything looks exactly the way it did before you closed your eyes, keep reading. If anything has changed, anything at all, you already know what is happening. Like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, have you ever felt watched? Story 2, the house that wasn't empty. The house sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by trees so tall and so close together that sunlight only reached the ground for an hour each day, around midday, when it fell in thin shafts through the canopy like something sacred and temporary. His name was James. He was 26. He had come to the house to be alone. It belonged to a distant relative, an uncle or a cousin. James could never remember which, who had inherited it years ago and never lived in it. The relative had offered it to James for the month, free of charge, with no conditions except that James keep the doors locked at night. James had agreed without thinking about it. He needed time away from everything, away from the city, away from his job, away from the noise that had been building inside his head for months like water behind a dam. The house was old. It was made of dark wood and gray stone, and it smelled of earth and something else, something sweet and faintly chemical that James couldn't identify. The furniture was sparse: a bed in the upstairs room, a table and 2 chairs in the kitchen, a single armchair by the fireplace in the living room facing a window that looked out onto the trees. There was no television, no radio. The phone signal came and went depending on the weather. James arrived on a Friday afternoon. He unpacked his bag, clothes, books, a laptop he did not intend to use, and stood in the kitchen and listened to the silence. It was not the silence he had expected. He had imagined the silence of nature: birds, wind, the occasional rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. What he heard instead was something thicker, heavier, a silence that had weight to it that pressed against his eardrums like deep water. It was the kind of silence that made you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, the sound of your own blood moving through your veins. He told himself it was just the isolation. He told himself he would get used to it. The first night he lay in the upstairs bedroom with the door closed and the window curtains drawn and listened. The house creaked. Old houses creak, wood expanding and contracting with changes in temperature, settling into the earth beneath it. James knew this. He told himself this. He repeated it silently like a prayer each time the sound came. At 11:17 at night, he checked the clock on his phone. He heard footsteps. Not outside, inside, downstairs, moving slowly across the kitchen floor. One step, a pause, another step. The sound was deliberate, patient. It moved from one side of the kitchen to the other, then stopped. James sat up in bed. His heart was beating very fast. He held his phone in front of him, the screen glowing white in the dark, and he listened. Silence. He waited 5 minutes, then 10. Nothing else happened. He lay back down and did not sleep until dawn. In the morning, he walked through the ground floor of the house and examined everything. The back door was locked. The windows were closed. There were no signs that anyone had been inside. No footprints on the floor. No disturbance of any kind. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and drank it slowly and told himself he had imagined it, or dreamed it, or heard something outside, an animal perhaps, moving through the undergrowth close to the walls. The second night, the footsteps came again. This time they were closer. This time they came up the stairs. James heard them clearly, the slow, heavy tread on each step, one after another, ascending toward the door of his bedroom. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the door and waited, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps, his hand trembling so badly that the beam of light shook against the wood. The footsteps stopped at his door. A long silence. James could not breathe. He could not move. The flashlight beam held steady against the closed door, and behind it on the other side he felt something. Not heard, felt. A presence. A weight of attention, like being observed through a keyhole by an eye that never blinked. Then slowly a sound. Not the door opening. Something smaller, something quieter. A thin, metallic ring, the sound of something falling, something small and hard, hitting the wooden floor on the other side of the door. James did not open the door that night. In the morning, when pale gray light came through the curtains, and the house was filled with the ordinary sounds of birds and wind and water dripping from the eaves, he opened the bedroom door and looked down. A knife lay on the floor, a kitchen knife, the kind used for preparing vegetables. It was one of the knives from the kitchen downstairs. James recognized it by a small chip in the handle. He had seen it the day before, in the wooden block on the counter, in its place among the others. He picked it up. The blade was cold, not the cold of metal that has been sitting in an unheated hallway overnight, a deeper cold. A cold that seemed to come from inside the metal itself, as though the knife had been stored somewhere much colder than this house for a very long time. James carried the knife downstairs and put it back in the block, and locked the kitchen door with the bolt from the inside, and went back upstairs and sat on the bed and stared at the wall. He called his relative on the phone. The signal was weak. The call connected and then dropped 3 times before he got through. "Is there someone staying near the house?" James asked. "A neighbor, someone who might have a key." A pause on the other end. Static crackled. "No," his relative said. "There's no one out there. There hasn't been anyone in that area for years. Why? Is everything all right?" James hesitated. "Yes," he said, "everything is fine." He hung up. That evening he considered leaving. He packed his bag and carried it downstairs and stood in the hallway with his coat on and his hand on the front door. Outside, the trees were black against a sky the color of ash. The road, if it could be called a road, stretched away into darkness. It was a 2-hour drive to the nearest town. The car would start. The engine was reliable. He could be gone within minutes. He stood there for a long time. He did not know why he didn't leave. Something held him, not fear exactly, something else. A feeling that leaving would not solve anything, that whatever was in this house, it was not attached to this house. It was attached to him. He put his bag down. He went back inside. He locked the door. On the 3rd night, he did not sleep at all. He sat in the armchair by the window with every light in the house turned on and the kitchen knife across his lap, and he watched the darkness outside and he listened. The footsteps came at midnight. They came up the stairs again, slowly, steadily, and this time they did not stop at his door. They passed it. They continued down the hallway, toward the end of the corridor where there was nothing, no room, no door, just a wall. And then they stopped. James stood up. He walked to the bedroom door and opened it and looked down the hallway. The hallway was empty. The overhead light buzzed and flickered. At the far end where the footsteps had stopped, there was only the wall, plain plaster, no door, no opening of any kind. He walked toward it. He put his hand on the wall. The plaster was cold, colder than it should have been. And beneath his palm, very faintly, he felt something, a vibration, a pulse, as though the wall itself were breathing. He pulled his hand away. He did not sleep that night either. The police came on the 5th day after James called them from the nearest town, a small station, 2 officers, both of them skeptical and polite. They walked through the house with him. They checked the doors, the windows, the locks. They found nothing out of place. No signs of forced entry. No evidence that anyone else had been inside. "Old houses make noise," one of them said, not unkindly. "Especially out here. The wind can do strange things." James nodded. He did not tell them about the knife. He did not tell them about the wall. He did not tell them about the thing he had seen on the 4th night, just before dawn, when he had looked up from the armchair and seen 2 figures standing at the foot of the stairs. They were tall. They were dark, not dressed in dark clothing, but dark themselves, as though they were made of shadow given shape and density. They had no visible faces. They stood perfectly still, side by side, and they looked at James. He could feel their attention like a physical force, like a hand pressing against his chest, and then they were gone. Not gone in the way a person leaves a room, gone in the way a light goes out. One moment they were there, the next they were not. No sound, no movement, no trace. James left the house on the 6th morning. He drove to town without stopping. He did not look in the rearview mirror. 3 days later, back in his apartment in the city, he opened his bedroom door to make his bed. On the center of his pillow, placed with care, was the kitchen knife. The same knife. The one with the chip in the handle. The one that had been in a house 2 hours away, in a block on a counter, behind a locked door. He stood in his doorway and looked at it and understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water flooding his chest, that the house had never been the problem. Story 3. The Woman in the Window. She moved into the apartment on a Saturday in early December. Her name was Sarah. She was 29. She had moved to the city to start over, new job, new place, new life. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a narrow building on a quiet street. It had large windows that let in good light during the day and looked out onto the street and the buildings opposite at night. She liked the windows. She liked the feeling of being above the ground, of being able to see out without being seen in. She was wrong about that last part. The first time she saw him was on a Tuesday evening, a week after she moved in. She was standing at the kitchen window, washing a glass, and she looked up and saw a man standing on the street below. He was standing very still, directly beneath her window, looking up at her. He was tall. He wore dark clothing. His face was in shadow. The streetlight behind him cast him in silhouette, and she could not see his features clearly, but she could feel his gaze. It was steady and fixed, and it did not move. Sarah set down the glass and stepped back from the window. When she looked again, a moment later, the man was gone. She told herself it meant nothing. People stood on streets. People looked up at buildings. It was a city. It happened. The second time was on Thursday. She was coming home from work, walking up the stairs to her floor, and she rounded the corner of the landing and stopped. He was standing at the end of the corridor near the door to the roof access. The same man, same height, same dark clothing, same stillness. He was looking at her. Sarah's hand tightened on the banister. She opened her mouth to say something, to ask him what he was doing there, who he was, what he wanted. But before she could speak, a door on the landing opened and a neighbor stepped out, a woman in her 60s carrying a bag of rubbish. And by the time Sarah looked back at the end of the corridor, the man was gone. "Did you see someone?" Sarah asked the neighbor. "A man standing right there at the end of the hall." The neighbor looked at her blankly. "No, love," she said. "There's no one there." Sarah stood on the landing for a long time after the neighbor had gone, looking at the empty corridor, listening to the silence. The notes began appearing on the fourth week. The first one was slipped under her front door overnight. A single sheet of white paper folded once. On it, written in small, neat handwriting, was a single sentence. "I have been watching you for longer than you think." Sarah read it 3 times. She turned it over. The back was blank. She looked at the paper, ordinary copy paper, the kind you could buy at any shop. The handwriting was precise and careful, each letter formed with the same deliberate pressure. It was not a threat exactly. It was a statement, a fact presented calmly, the way you might state the time of day or the weather. She photographed it with her phone and sent it to the police non-emergency number. A woman on the line listened politely and told Sarah they would send someone to take a look. No one came. The second note appeared 2 days later. This one said, "You looked beautiful tonight, the blue dress." Sarah had worn a blue dress the evening before, to dinner with a friend at a restaurant 3 miles away. She had not worn it in her apartment. She had not been near her building while wearing it. The third note said only, "Room 401. Her apartment number. Sarah changed her locks. She installed a small camera above her front door, a cheap Wi-Fi camera that recorded footage to her phone. She checked it every morning and every evening. For 2 weeks, the footage showed nothing. The corridor outside her door, empty and still, lit by the same flat fluorescent light, hour after hour after hour. Then, on a Wednesday night, the camera recorded something. Sarah watched the footage on her phone the next morning, sitting in bed with coffee, scrolling through the timeline. At 3:14 in the morning, the image flickered. Not a glitch, something else. The picture distorted, the colors bleeding and warping for 3 seconds, and then it snapped back to normal. And in that moment of distortion, a figure was visible, standing directly in front of the camera, close enough that Sarah could see the texture of his clothing, the dark fabric, the way it hung on his frame. His face was turned up toward the lens. He had no reflection. Sarah paused the footage. She rewound it. She watched it again, frame by frame. Each frame showed the same thing, the man standing in front of the camera, his face angled upward. And on the wall behind him, where the corridor should have been visible, there was nothing. No wall, no floor, no light, just darkness. A depth of darkness that seemed to extend infinitely in every direction, as though the corridor itself had been erased. Sarah watched the footage 6 times. Then she turned off her phone and sat in the silence of her apartment and tried to breathe normally. She moved out the following weekend. She packed everything into boxes and hired a van and drove to a new apartment in a different part of the city, a ground floor flat this time, with smaller windows and a view of a brick wall. She did not tell anyone where she was going except her closest friend, whose number she called from the road. "I need to get away from that place," Sarah said. "Something is wrong there. Something is very wrong." Her friend was sympathetic. She offered her spare room. Sarah declined. She needed to be alone. She needed to think. The new apartment was quiet. It was small and unremarkable, and it felt safe, in the way that ground floor flats feel safe, close to the earth, close to the exit, close to the ordinary world. Sarah spent the first few nights not sleeping, sitting on the sofa with every light on, watching the door and the windows. Nothing happened. No notes. No figures. No camera footage that showed anything other than an empty hallway. She began to sleep again. She began to eat normally. She began, slowly, to believe that whatever had been happening in the old apartment had ended. It had not ended. On a Friday night, 2 weeks after the move, Sarah came home from work and found her front door unlocked. She stood in the hallway with her keys in her hand and stared at the lock. She had locked it that morning. She always locked it. She checked it twice every time she left, a habit born of the fear that had taken root in her chest and not yet released its grip. She pushed the door open and stepped inside and turned on the lights. The apartment looked normal. Everything was where she had left it. Nothing was out of place. Nothing had been moved or disturbed or touched. Except on the kitchen table. A photograph. Sarah walked toward it slowly. Her legs felt strange, disconnected from her body, as though she were watching herself move from somewhere far away. She reached the table and looked down at the photograph. It showed the inside of her apartment. This apartment, the one she had moved into 2 weeks ago. It showed the living room, the sofa, the small television, the bookshelf she had assembled herself. And on the sofa, curled up with a blanket, was Sarah, asleep. Her face relaxed, her mouth slightly open, one hand hanging off the edge of the cushion. The photograph had been taken from inside the apartment, from somewhere near the kitchen, looking toward the living room, from exactly where Sarah was standing now. She looked up. She looked at the corner of the room where the photograph had been taken from. The corner was empty. The shadows pooled there in the way shadows pool in small rooms at night, thick and dark and ordinary. But Sarah did not feel alone. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in that same small, neat handwriting, was a single line. "I told you, I have been watching you for longer than you think." Sarah set the photograph down. She picked up her phone and dialed the police and reported a break-in. Officers arrived within 20 minutes. They searched the apartment. They found no signs of forced entry. The door lock was intact. The windows were sealed from the inside. There was no way in and no way out that Sarah had not used herself. The officers were polite. They took the photograph as evidence. They told Sarah they would be in touch if they found anything. Sarah stood in her apartment after they left and looked at the corner of the room where the photograph had been taken from. She stood there for a long time. The silence was total. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses against the skin, that makes you aware of every sound your own body makes. And then, very quietly, from somewhere she could not identify, not from the walls, not from the floor, not from any direction at all, but from everywhere at once, she heard a whisper. It was not words exactly. It was the shape of words without their meaning, a breath shaped into something almost human, almost language, almost a name. Sarah did not move. She did not breathe. She stood in the middle of her apartment and she listened, and the whisper came again, and this time it was closer. The connection. 3 stories, 3 different cities, 3 different lives. But Alina, in her dormitory room, had found something in the last of Daniel's messages to Marcus. A message Marcus had not deleted, tucked deep in the conversation history, sent weeks before Alina had ever heard of Ashwood University. The message contained a single photograph. It showed a narrow building on a quiet street, a ground-floor flat with small windows and a view of a brick wall. And standing on the street outside, barely visible in the shadow of the doorway, a figure. Tall, dark, still. James, in his apartment in the city, had found something on the back of the kitchen knife, scratched into the wood of the handle, so small and so faint that he had almost missed it. A number, not a phone number or an address. A single digit, repeated 3 times. 401. Sarah, in her new apartment, had found, after the police left, after the silence settled, after she finally allowed herself to look, a symbol scratched into the plaster of the wall behind the sofa. Small, deliberate. The same symbol that Alina had seen carved into a stone above a doorway on the Ashwood campus. The same symbol that James had found etched into the wood of the headboard in the remote house. The same symbol that appeared, again and again, in the margins of Daniel's lecture notes. None of them had ever met each other. None of them had ever heard the other's names. But Daniel had known all of them. The records at Ashwood University showed that a teaching assistant named Daniel had been employed there for 11 years. When Alina went to the registrar's office, after Marcus had gone, after the photographs had been taken down from her wall, someone had taken them overnight, leaving only the red thumbtacks. She asked to see his file. The registrar looked at her screen for a long time. Then she looked at Alina with an expression Alina could not read. "There is no record of anyone by that name," the registrar said. "There has never been a teaching assistant with that name at this university." Alina stood very still. "That's not possible," she said. "I attended his seminar every week for 2 months. There were 20 other students in the room." The registrar shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't know what to tell you, but the name isn't in our system. It has never been in our system." Alina left the office and walked out onto the campus and stood in the cold air and looked at the buildings around her. The tall gray stone, the arched windows, the corridors that stretched away into shadow, and she understood, with a certainty that settled into her bones like frost, that Daniel was still here. Not in any way she could prove, not in any way that could be recorded or reported or explained. But he was here, watching, waiting, patient in the way that only something very old and very hungry can be patient. And somewhere, in a ground floor flat with small windows, Sarah was standing in the dark, listening to a whisper that was getting closer. And somewhere, in a city apartment, James was staring at a kitchen knife on his pillow and wondering what would happen when he closed his eyes. And somewhere, in no place, in every place, in the space between one breath and the next, Daniel was watching all of them. He had always been watching. If you made it to the end, do not close this video yet. Do not put down your phone. Do not turn off your screen. Think about where you are right now. Think about the room you are sitting in. Think about the windows. Think about whether anyone could see you through them. Think about the last time you felt watched, truly watched, and could not explain why. Like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, have you ever woken up and felt like someone had been in your room while you slept? Because the thing about stories like these is that they are not always stories. Sometimes they are warnings. And sometimes, the person telling the story already knows where you live.